You're on Twitter, we'll be starting in about 5 minutes, but if you leave a comment on Twitter, can you hear the music while the slideshow is up, or can you only hear it when I'm showing the video for the music? Leave a comment on the Twitter post if you can hear the music right now while the slideshow is up. Thank you. Hey, Savad, could you still hear the music when I had the slides up? That's the question for the day.
I wasn't listening that long. I don't
I'm
think
gonna play the
so.
music, and then I'm going to, put the slideshow up again. Can you still hear the music now?
No, I cannot.
Okay, that's what I needed to know. All right. Hey, let's get started. We are on class 8 already of our deep dive into Jordan Peterson in the context of Children of Nietzsche, Thinkers Made Possible. We're going to be looking in the third year at decoding Zarathustra, but also at the twin relationship of the existentialists of Kierkegaard and Nietzsche. And we're going to look at Jung and William James and Jordan Peterson. So this is the start of our deep dive into Jordan Peterson. We have just finished video 1 of his biblical psychological significance of the biblical stories. I was showing some slides that we went over in the previous 2 videos. I'll remove those now, and let's jump into it.
Okay, well, I thought this time that I would actually cover some of the biblical stories. And hopefully a number of them. As I said last time, I'm going to go through this, well, as fast as I am able to. I want to do it as complete a job as possible. And of course, the probability that I'll get through the entire Bible is very low. But we'll get through a lot of the major stories in the beginning of it, and that's a good start. And then, assuming that this all goes well, then maybe I'll try to do the same thing again, either in the fall or next year. So, assuming that everything is still working out properly next year. It's a long ways away. All right, so I guess we'll start. So last week, I talked to you about a line in the New Testament that was from John, and it was a line that was designed to parallel the opening of Genesis, and it's a really important line, and I thought I would re-emphasize it because the Bible is a book that's been written forward and backwards in time in some sense, like most books, because if you write a book, of course, when you get to the end, if you're the writer, you can adjust the beginning and so on. So it has this appearance of linearity, but it isn't linear. It's like you're God in some sense standing outside of time. That's your book, and you can play with time anywhere along it. And the people who put the book together, or the books together, took full advantage of that, and that makes the story. It gives the story odd parallels in many places, in a very large number of places. And this is one of the major parallels, at least from the perspective of the Christian interpretation of the Bible, which of course includes the New Testament. And so there's this strange idea that Christ was the same factor or force that God used at the beginning of time to speak habitable order into being. And that's a very, very strange idea. It's not something that can be just easily dismissed as superstition, partly because it's so strange. It doesn't even fit the definition of like a superstitious belief. It's a dreamlike belief in some sense. And what I see many of the ideas in the Bible as is these dreamlike ideas that underlie our normative cognition and that constitute the ground from which our more articulated and explicit ideas have emerged. And this one's so complicated, this idea is so complicated that it's still mostly embedded in dreamlike form, but it seems to have something to do with the primacy of consciousness. And this is one of the biggest issues regarding the structure of reality, as far as I can tell, because everyone from physicists to neurobiologists debates this. There's the stumbling block for a purely objective view of the world seems to me to be consciousness. And consciousness has all sorts of strange properties. For example, it isn't obvious what constitutes time, or at least duration, in the absence of consciousness. And it isn't also easy to understand what constitutes being in the absence of consciousness, because it seems to be the case, well, if a movie is running and there's no one to watch it, I know it sounds like the tree in the forest idea, but it's not that idea at all. If a movie is running and no one's watching it, in what sense is, can you say that there's even a movie running? Because the movie seems to be the experience of the movie, not the objective elements of the movie. And there's something about the world, at least insofar as we're in it as human beings, that is dependent on conscious experience of the world. Now, of course, you can take consciousness out of the world and say, well, if none of us were here, if there was no such thing as consciousness, then the cosmos would continue running the way it is running. But of course, it depends on what exactly you mean by the cosmos when you make a statement like that, because there's something about the subjective experience of reality that gives it reality. Or at least that's one way of looking at it. And since we're all pretty enamored of our own consciousnesses, although they're painful because they define our being, it's not unreasonable to give consciousness a kind of metaphysical primacy. Now, and it's deeper than that, you know, it's deeper idea than that, because there are physicists, and they're not trivial physicists like John Wheeler, who believes that in some sense consciousness plays a constitutive role in transforming the chaotic potential of being into the actuality of being. And he actually thinks about it, he's not alive anymore, but he actually thought about it as playing a constitutive role, you know. And then from the neurobiological perspective, or from the scientific perspective, it's like consciousness is not something we understand. I don't think we understand it at all. It's something we can't get a handle on with our fundamental materialist philosophy. And I don't know why that is. It's quite frustrating if you're a scientist, but it isn't clear to me that we've made any progress whatsoever in understanding consciousness, even though, well, we've been trying to understand it for hundreds of years. And even though psychologists and neurobiologists and so forth have really put a lot of effort into understanding consciousness from a scientific perspective in the last 50 years. So anyways, what it seems to me is the idea that God used the word to extract order out of habitable order out of chaos at the beginning of time, which is roughly the right way of thinking about it, seems to me deeply allied with the idea that what it is that we do as human beings is encounter something like a formless and potential chaos. I mean, we're not omniscient, obviously, and we can't just do whatever we want, but we encounter a formless and chaotic potential. That's always what we're grappling with. And somehow we use our consciousness to give that form. And this is how people act. Like if you look at how they regard themselves, it's how they act, because you say things to people like, well, you should live up to your potential. And you make a case that there's something about a person that's more than what is, that yet could be if only they participated in the process properly. And everyone knows what that means, and no one acts like a mystery has been uttered when you say that. And you know, you can see a situation in your own life that's full of potential. You're often extremely excited when you encounter something that's full of potential, because what you see is something that could be. You see a future beckoning for you that could be if only you interacted with it properly. And it activates your nervous system, right, in a very basic way. And we even understand how that happens, works, because the systems that mediate positive emotion, which are governed roughly by the neurochemical dopamine, and which have their roots way down in the ancient hypothalamus, a very, very archaic and fundamental part of the brain, that responds to potential, which is the possibility of accruing something new and valuable. It responds to potential with active movement forward.
Hey, let's pause for a moment. I hate to interrupt him, but let's pause for a quick moment here. Because he's obviously he's not yet talking about the biblical stories, but he's highlighting something that he mentioned in the first video that he's going to do more highlighting of now, which is this phenomenology approach. Okay, so we've been doing a lot of other philosophy classes, and we're going to tie it all together real quickly here. David Hume, he's in the cave and he thinks the shadows are what's real, and it's all that's real. Even he perceiving the shadows is only real to the degree that he's interacting with the shadows, right? He's as much in the cave. He wants to press himself up against the wall and be a shadow because that's all he really knows. Okay, so here's the challenge. And it's coming from that post-Cartesian crisis of the battle between rationalists and empiricists. So where do we get our knowledge from? What do we know is really real? Okay, so on the one end of the spectrum, you've got the Socratic idealist types. And on the other end, you have a radical empiricist like David Hume, who's saying, no, I only know things through my senses, but that's all I know. I've never even sensed myself sensing those things. So I don't even know that that's real. It's just the shadows themselves. One thing we can think about is as the phenomenology perspective is to just embrace that, to just swallow it whole and say, look, the only way out is through. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, okay, I can't affirm anything beyond that, really. I have no right, as Nietzsche said, to talk of the thing itself or the thing in itself. And we were reading Descartes, who made the exact same distinction yesterday when we were looking at his meditations. He's saying, look, I don't even know if there's a real world out there, but I seem to be sensing things. And then my sense perception, rightly called, would be the thing that's having that experience. The sense of seeing yellowness is for sure. It's indubitable that I'm having that experience. I just don't know that there's a yellow object yet. And then, of course, he tried to rebuild and get to the point of being able to affirm that there is an object out there. Okay. So again, none of this is new. We didn't have to wait for Hume or anybody. All of these thinkers are talking about the same things over time, which we won't highlight again now. But okay, so back to Descartes. Um, he's drawn a distinction between the world as it seems to me, the world that is how about this? The world that is presented to me. And Kant came up with the constructions. He came up with a science or a philosophy of figuring out what it is that the brain has to do with whatever's real, right? These aren't anti-realists. There's a real world out there, but what's coming into us through our senses has to be processed. It has to be constructed in a certain way. There's a constitutive element of reality that is brought to being by our consciousness. Okay, this is what Peterson's trying to affirm here, right? So let's test that a little bit and see how real it is. Is the grass green if there were no people? Is there any real objective fact out there without a consciousness? And the phenomenologists are going to say, no, no, no. What I know most to be real is the way the world is, that as it can present itself to me, and that involves an element of, well, it's the subjective side of it, right? It's how it appears to the subject. And what's happening is the consciousness is playing a constitutive role in all of that. And so that's what Peterson is sort of starting as his base point, because he wants to look at the biblical stories through narrative and Jungian archetypes and all of that, but he wants to look at it also through the lens of the psychological significance of it. So what he's not going to do is reduce the story, right? We talked about the difference between symbols and signs. He's not going to reduce it to say God is a code word for our consciousness. He's not going to do that. But he is going to strongly hint at the idea that what is the spark of the divine within us, that the story is telling us we have, being made in his image, is something like, let's go to the Cartesian lens. There's pure thinking over here, and then there's objective reality apart from individuals who are perceiving it over here, and we're in the middle. And the world that we have to encounter is actually made up of both of those things. So back to the idea that grass is green with no people. Well, it's not. There's nothing green about electromagnetic radiation. You can study physics and lenses and radioactive waves or I'm sorry, electromagnetic radiation. You can look at 336 nanometers and measure it all in the objective sense that you want. You're not going to find the greenness in it. You're not going to find the sweetness in a glucose molecule. You know, dung tastes very sweet to a dung beetle, probably, right? It doesn't taste sweet to us. The sweetness isn't in the molecules themselves, and yet the experience of it and the value that we can place on it it's necessary that we be a character in the world. So we're doing this Jordan Peterson deep dive in the context of the Nietzschean backbone. So what Nietzsche said to the scientismists, the people who want to objectify reality and describe it as if they're outside the universe, is one, that's a Christian idea, being outside the universe. You only had the ability to think in that way because you're a sub-denomination of Christianity, which posited a God ex nihilo post the Cartesian age, who has a universe on a carpenter's workbench, and he's fit. You're trying to have his perspective, but you don't have that perspective. So he says, okay, well, let's go to Kepler. Tell us. Tell us about your science. Tell us about all these impressive ideas and these formulas and the truth that you're getting to that's purely objective and has extracted from the world the subject. He says, okay, well, I did all this data collection. I've got all of the locations of the single star at different times, and I wrote out all the data, and I looked at it, and I realized the data fits in perfectly with the equation for an ellipse. Well, that's amazing. What a revelation. You could give me a new time t, and I could put it into that equation, and I can tell you where the star will be. The star travels in this path. Here, I've got empty space, a dark background. Let me draw the path that the star will be traveling in. And Nietzsche says, oh, very impressive. That's what you think is this ultimate knowledge, the laws of physics that don't cease to exist at your skull and that define everything and all of that. Very impressive. May I ask a question? Nietzsche says. He says, what would happen if you went up to a star and you talked to it about the dark areas of space that it will soon be inhabiting? What would that mean to the star? You're pretending to be outside the universe, but you're not, and neither is the star. We're interrelated. We are participating in this ongoing project. Uh, um, I'm so sorry. We're participating in this ongoing creative project of sustaining and creating being, of pushing it forward towards something perhaps. And this doesn't have to be true or false, but it's the impression that Peterson is getting from the story through this lens, right? He's taking the phenomenological lens and he's looking at the ancient mythopoetry and he's saying, it's like God is everything. And then it's like, well, now we're in history over here. And there's like a transition where there's the logos communication between the subject consciousness and the object of the chaotic primordial thing that it spoke the logos into, right? So he's bringing up in the beginning was the word was with God, and the word was God. And he's saying, well, there's another verse that says Christ was crucified at the foundations of the world, that what makes being possible is a means of communication, the logos translation between infinite being and potentiality. Okay, and he looked at some other great mythopoetic texts, and he's going to probably look at Egypt today, so I'll shut up, where he says, look, they're getting at the same thing. And he's not trying to equate them and say that they're all equal or that they're all saying the same thing. He's not that interested in that. But he is using the exact same lenses to look at other mythopoetry. And for him, he'll probably talk more about this, although he talked about it in the last video. He'll probably talk more about it today. The Petersonian view of the world is something like the communicative love dance chase between the yin and the yang, and that everything is a reflection of that, and that we sort of live on the border between the two. That's where the habitable order is where there's right relationship between these two impossibly opposite things. And so he's taking that and saying, well, if that's true of everything, it's true of consciousness and it's true of our relationship to the physical world. So I'll stop talking now, but let's go on and see.
Forward and engagement. And so we're engaged in the world as potential, and it looks like consciousness does that. And so there's this idea that, and this is the main idea that I think is being put forth in Genesis 1. It's something like, and you see this in mythology, like from what I've been able to gather, there's always three causal elements that make up being at the bottom of world mythology. And one is the formless potential that makes up being once it's interacted with, and that's generally given a feminine nature. And I think that's because it's like the source from which all things emerge and rise. It's something like that. It's more complicated than that, but it's something like that. And then there's some kind of interpretive structure that has to grapple with that formless potential. And I think that's the sort of thing that was alluded to by Immanuel Kant when he was criticizing the notion that all of our information comes from sense data, which would be the pure empirical perspective, right? Because when you encounter the world, you encounter it with a cognitive structure that already has shape. And so it's already in you, this structure. And without that a priori structure, you wouldn't be able to take the formless potential and give it structure. And I think that's something, it's akin in some way to the idea of God the Father. And I'll try to develop that idea more. It's the notion that there's something in all of us that transcends all of us, that's deeply structural, that's part of this ancient, well, I would say evolutionary and cultural process that enables us to grapple with the formless potential and bring forth reality, roughly speaking. And then there's the final element, and that element seems to be something like consciousness itself, the consciousness that actually inheres in the individual. So it's not only that you have a structure, it's that the structure has the capacity for action in the world. And it's like, you're the spirit that gives the dead structure life. It's something like that. And as far as I can tell, the Trinitarian notion that characterizes Christianity is something like, well, formless potential, which is never given the status of a deity in Christianity. And then the notion that there's an a priori interpretive structure that's a consequence of our ancient existence as beings. It goes back as as far in time as you can go, the notion of a structure. And then the idea of a consciousness that is the tool of that structure and that interacts with the world and gives it reality. And that's the Word, as far as I can tell. And so the notion is that there's a Father, and that's the structure, and there's a Son that's transcendent, that characterizes consciousness itself, and that it's the Son, the speaking of the Son, that is the active principle that turns chaos into order. And that's
Okay. So we've been doing a lot of other philosophy classes, and we're doing the a priori section, and all of this stuff is really syncing together. I think it's worth noticing that the Kantian consciousness structures that he's talking about, the ones that make it possible to constitute a world that can be presented to a subject, right? Those are very much the same types of things that Socrates is talking about as the most foundationally real things. Okay. He identified that, you shouldn't be able to, when he's talking about you shouldn't be able to make sense of a bunch of different things, like how Hume describes. It's always varying and changing. How do I have a notion of sameness in the first place? You're bringing it to the story. That's what Socrates said. Hey, Plato said, hey, you must have been one with the divine at some point before you were born, because you're bringing this knowledge to it. You weren't able to make sense of the world. And we talked last time or a few videos ago about that weird experiment with the cat, right? The cat that's harnessed and can't walk around, and then it's attached to another cat that does walk around. So the cat sees and has as much sensory input through its eyes as the other cat, because everywhere the one cat moves, the other cat can have that much data input. When they finally take the cat out of the harness, it's been that way its whole life, it can't even walk. It doesn't understand the world. It doesn't have a world to interact with, because all it's been doing is having that visual sensory input, but it hasn't learned to see things, right? And so that's different, of course, than the Socratic idea. The Socratic idea is not that you learn it through interacting with it, but Peterson's gonna have the idea that you map the world onto your spine, and that it's sort of a process. So again, we're not saying that he's got the Socratic view here, but for Socrates, what he's doing is he's identifying the cognitive structures that allow you to make sense of the world at all, and saying that's a part of reality. That's more real, says Plato, at least, than the stuff you think you're interacting with. And it's exactly the same thing that Kant is talking about. So it's just cool that all of our classes are tying together in this all at once. And we'll go on.
such a sophisticated idea as far as I'm concerned, because, well, there's something about it that's at least phenomenologically accurate, because you do have an interpretive structure and you couldn't understand anything without it. Your very body is an interpretive structure, right? It's been crafted over, let's say, 3 billion years of evolution. Without that, you wouldn't be able to perceive anything. And it's taken a lot of death and struggle and tragedy to produce you, the thing that's capable of encountering this immense chaos that surrounds us, and to transform it into habitable order. And then there's the idea too, of course, that's deeply embedded in the first chapters of Genesis, which is a staggering idea, and certainly not one that's likely, that human beings were made in the image of God, both male and female were made in the image of God. And that's, of course, a very difficult thing to understand, partly because the God that's referred to in those chapters has a kind of polytheistic element, although it's an element that's moving rapidly towards a unified monotheism. But it's not also obvious to me why people would come up with that concept, because I don't really think that when we think about each other, we immediately think godlike. The notion that every single human being, regardless of their peculiarities and strangenesses and sins and crimes and all of that, has something divine in them that needs to be regarded with respect, and that plays an integral role, at least an analogous role, in the creation of habitable order out of chaos. That's a magnificent, remarkable, crazy idea. And yet we developed it, and I do firmly believe that it sits at the base of our legal system. I think it is the cornerstone of our legal system. That's the notion that everyone is equal before God, which is, of course, that's such a strange idea. It's very difficult to understand how anybody could have ever come up with that idea, because the manifold differences between people are so obvious and so evident that you could say the natural way of viewing someone or human beings is in this extremely hierarchical manner, where some people are contemptible and easily brushed off as pointless and pathological and without value whatsoever, and all the power accrues to a certain tiny, aristocratic minority at the top. But if you look at the way that the idea of the individual sovereignty developed, it's clear that it unfolded over thousands and perhaps 10,000s of years before it became something firmly fixed in the imagination that each individual had something of transcendent value about them. And man, I tell you, we dispense with that idea at our serious peril. And so, and if you're going to take that idea seriously, then, which you do because you act it out, because otherwise you wouldn't be law-abiding citizens, right? You act that idea out. It's firmly shared by everyone who acts in a civilized manner. The question is, why in the world do you believe it, assuming that you believe what you act out, which I think is a really good way of fundamentally defining belief. So, all right, so that's the sort of idea, is that there's this God of tradition and structure. That's God the Father, who uses the Son, which is more of an active force, and primarily something that's verbal, which I also think is extremely interesting, because it's associated not with thought precisely, but with speech. And I think the reason for that is that there's something to speech that's more than mere thought. And I think part of the reason for that is that speech is a public utterance. And at least in principle, speech is something that's shaped by the existence of everyone else, at least across time. Because when you speak, your speech is put forward in the world as a causal element, and it's also subject to criticism and cooperation and mutual shaping. And so there's an idea here too that speech is that the cognitive processes that bring habitable reality out of uninhabitable chaos have this collective and public element, which is part of the reason, by the way, that I'm an advocate of free speech, let's say, above all, because I don't think, although it is the case, for example, in the Canadian Bill of Rights, that every single right has equal value. That's the theory. It's an idiotic theory, because it's absolutely impossible for a large set of rights to have absolutely equal stances. That cannot happen. There's no way that can ever work.
So just briefly, again, we're doing this in the context of our Nietzsche backbone course, and Zarathustra once said, one virtue is more of a virtue than two. It's more of a noose to hang yourself. He goes, the virtues, if you have too many of, they quarrel with each other like mistresses. If that was his mythopoetic, by the way, he's using narrative and art in order to depict his philosophical idea. But that idea had to have been understood by Jung and seized on. And there's a lot of Nietzsche's legacy that's in what makes a thinker like Jordan Peterson possible. And so we'll just make that quick comment here.
Work, but that is the legal judgment. But I think it's a huge mistake, because free speech has this divine quality, let's say, that you can't escape from, because it's the thing that manufactures everything else. And I do think that the dream that you could think of as encapsulated in the stories in Genesis is the dream by which human beings dreamed up the idea that we would now consider consciousness. Because it took us a long time to figure out the word consciousness. It's not like it's bloody obvious. Who knows how many thousands of years, or who knows what struggles we had to undertake to abstract out something like consciousness, and how we had to represent that dramatically, say, or symbolically, or in a dreamlike fashion before we could actually formulate the term and localize that to some degree in people. It's very sophisticated. So John makes the case that, well, there's an emanation of God, or an element of God, the transcendent consciousness, it's something like that acts directly and in a sort of living way with the underlying potential of the world. And I think that that's phenomenologically accurate, and I do think that that's the way we regard our lives. Because, when you think about it too, we tend to think that what you encounter when you're looking at the world is the material world, but that isn't how you act.
Since he brought up consciousness being depicted in artistic form, let's just take a quick look at the Google Art project. These are paintings and statues of Psyche. We'll just click on a couple of them. Psyche and Cupid. Psyche and Amor. See if we can make this larger here. So he's talking about is imagine 100,000 years ago, there's these cave dwelling apes and there's savannah dwelling apes and these tree dwelling apes. And we're like, he's imagining how long it would take for us to make statues and paintings and start to talk about the personal forms that exist in the world that we need to know exist and relate to them. And then he says, imagine coming up with the abstraction of consciousness, right? And to depict it in artistic form. This is Psyche here, to picture it in artistic form long before you can even put words to it. I mean, we've got neuroscience, which he's been bringing up. We've got psychology. We've got mind philosophy. We've got all sorts of subjects from various scientific and also mythopoetic approaches for trying to understand our own minds and what this consciousness is and what role it plays in being. And he's saying, yeah, we're talking about it. We're stumbling through talking about it. We're gonna in our mind philosophy course that we're just getting through the historical background, and we're gonna look at lots of different attempts to try to understand it from reductionist and emergence theories, behaviorism, functionalism, all qualia arguments, all sorts of ways to try to understand what this thing is. But again, he's bringing us back to a language that's pre the propositional. And he's saying, we were thinking about this. We were meditating on this. We were trying to relate to these ideas for 150,000 years through art. And when we were doing just that, we were building cathedrals and we were building pyramids. And so there could be some real profound truth in this art. And again, so he's not reducing the Bible to art. He's not saying that's all it is. He's saying it's at least that. And if you're going to try to read it like a science textbook, you're kind of missing out on what we could be getting out of this. All right, we won't look at the art anymore, but that's worth meditating on. You can stare at some of these paintings for many hours. I'll shut that off right now.
You do
For that matter, you can stare at cave paintings for many hours. So it's astonishing.
act as if you're in a place of potential, and also in a place of potential that you can actually transform, which is also something extraordinarily strange, because we do treat each other as if we're capable of bringing new forms into the world in some permanent manner of potential, and that isn't how you act. Think that what you encounter when you're looking at the world, when you think about it too, we tend to think that what you encounter when you're looking at the world is the material world, but that isn't how you act. You do act as if you're in a place of potential, and also in a place of potential that you can actually transform, which is also something extraordinarily strange, because we do treat each other as if we're capable of bringing new forms into the world in some permanent manner, right? And we treat each other as if we have free choice and free will, and perhaps we don't. But it's certainly the case that societies that are predicated on the idea that we don't do very well. And societies that are predicated on the idea that we...
Quick nod to what? You're so interested, Savad, and I know you're doing a deep dive into all this, but he keeps bringing up these same ideas that we talked in the first place. What you believe is detectable by how you act. He goes, you say you believe in an objective world and that the laws of physics, that's the way it is, but that's not how you act. So it's not really what you believe. You just believe you're supposed to say it. But what you really believe is this other thing, that you're a character influencing the story or something like that. But then he says, all right, look, you can say it's not true. Maybe it's not true what we're talking about here, but there's a pragmatism element. I know that's what you're doing your deep dive studies into. There's a William Jamesian pragmatism element. Try organizing a society or even living an individual life as if you really do think what you pretend you think but couldn't possibly think, because you can't act it by thinking in that way, and see how well it goes. It's not going to go. There's something less true about it. If every civilization that wanted to really behave as if they thought it was the case, they would die. They would have no reason for aiming in a direction. They wouldn't be able to even recognize as meaningful the question, who are we and what direction should we be aiming and how do we get there? That's all characterological. It's all narrative. It's all the language of the inspired artist. and the narrative and the poetry and all of that stuff. That's the language for talking about characters. The scientific language is not bad. We're not throwing it out, right? He doesn't want to believe things that outrage experiments, and he wants to have a dialectic between the two. He wants to tie himself to it so that he doesn't go so far afield that he's believing absurdities. He's not binning science, but he's saying you're not a scientist. Scientists aren't scientists even when they're in the lab. They require peer review and all sorts of structures to keep them being scientific. Nobody actually thinks that way on the ride home from the lab when they're hungry and imagining the meal they're going to have with their spouse. That's just not how that's not what you really believe, right? And this is a Nietzschean um, Nietzsche once said, I've been a psychologist through and through the whole time. He's going to judge the philosophy by the philosopher, and he's going to judge the philosopher by the philosophy. He's going to do psychoanalysis, and he gets right to the depths of things. And often it's very harsh criticism. Often it's the thing that you're most saying is the enemy that is really what defines you. And he does that. He does that many times in Zarathustra, and we'll look at it in our course. But um, it's very Nietzschean to come and say, "Look, you say you believe this, but you don't. You don't even know what you believe. You don't know what's motivating you. Here's the language of dream and art and poetry," is what Jung would say, maybe the best student of Nietzsche. Is that here is a language that's talking to you about your character and as a character, and it's not stripping the subjective away. It's not regarding as meaningless anything that's subjective. It's starting with the character and starting with the subject and saying, look, let's talk about things as objects and see if we can build a spaceship and an iPad and maybe even come to understand humanity's significant things about the world we live in, and geology and physics and all of that's great. But there's this other language, and you can't really build a civilization off of this language. And this language probably requires this one as the foundational fundamental structure upon which it can build its pillars. Um, so he's saying exactly what he was saying in the first one, but it's getting clearer now. Like, one of the things we're trying to do is understand Peterson's perspective and his approach and the tools he's using. And he's underlying, again, he's not even on verse 1 yet. I think he's going to go through this whole lecture before he gets to verse 2. But he's saying, look, this is something we can do. This is an appropriate way of trying to answer questions about who we are and how we should live. And it's actually the only language available to us for that. And there's great riches that have given us whole civilizations. Let's stop throwing it out. Let's go back to it and see what we can find.
We do seem to do a lot better. Plus, people tend to get very annoyed at you if you treat them like they're automatons that lack free will. There's something that people find very, I would say, constraining, slave-like about that even, that the demand that you don't have actual autonomy, and even worse, that you're not responsible for your choices. It's an insult to someone to suggest to them that they're not responsible for their choices. You usually, to do that to someone from a legal perspective, you have to argue something like diminished capacity, right? Well, you're mentally ill, or you don't have the intellectual capacity, or you were addled by some substance, or you had a brain injury or something, and that's why you're not responsible for your actions. Otherwise, part of the respect that you give to another human being is the assumption that they're responsible for their actions. And some of that can be, well, if you do something bad, then you're responsible for it. But part of that too is that if you do something good, you're also responsible for that. And that also seems necessary because, do you really, it's got to be more annoying than anything else you can imagine to strive virtuously, let's say, to produce something of extreme value and then to be treated as if that was a mere deterministic outcome and that your actual choices had nothing to do with that. People find that sort of thing extraordinarily punishing. And so I'm willing to, I know that there are debates about all these things and debates about free will and debates about the nature of consciousness, but I'm trying to take a clear look at how people act and how they want to be treated, and then to trace it back to these old ideas to see if there's some metaphysical, let's say, metaphysical connection. So, all right.
He hinted earlier at something that we could have highlighted as well when he's talking about this. This is how you act. Well, earlier he said it took hundreds of thousands, millions of years of death and suffering to make you the sort of thing that is acting the way you are, right? So he's got his evolutionary lens still working as well, like he promised. But There's a read common sense idea. There's a William Jamesian pragmatism idea here that he's bringing up, which is, okay, wait a minute, hold on. You've got some a priori notions. You've got some things that seem to be written into you because nothing that you experienced allowed them to be written into you later. It's that this is the sort of creature you are. You're inclined to think and to constitute the data coming into you in these ways to make the world presentable. Well, where the hell did that come from? And this brings up a really interesting, let's call it a Petersonian explicit or implicit notion that perhaps if he doesn't say it explicitly, he's clearly dancing up close to the line of trying to say something like this. And we're not going to put words in his mouth, but he really flirts with and pushes up towards this idea a lot. And the idea is something like this: to the literalists and to the scientismists, we're going to just dismiss them for a moment and say, okay, what's well, we're gonna say to them, okay, to the literalists, yeah, there's a God. That's the whole point of the Bible. He's a real character. He's over in a certain location. However you want to conceptualize it, fine. That's true. We're not interested in whether or not it's true. And to the Dawkinites, we're going to say, of course, there's no such thing as that. Exactly. It's not meant to be read that way. We're gonna give them both what they really want, and then we're gonna say both of you shouldn't be wanting what you really want. What you should be wanting is the profound image presented notions that are deeply foundationally inescapable and important that are sewn into your very subconscious, into your very body. That's what we're really able to get here. And he's going to say, okay, well, what does this text tell us in a literal way? And again, to the literalists, it's of course true literally. And to the Dawkinites, of course, it's not true literally. But what is it literally saying? Right, again, we're just not interested in that question. So we're not picking which one we actually agree with. We're saying, forget that for a minute. What it's saying is, you were created by God in his image. Okay. Well, the first thing is the objects don't seem to have any consciousness. So maybe that's part of our image. And he talked about that. But the second thing is this: what if we did a William Jamesian radical embrace of Darwinism? And there's something heretical about what I'm going to say, which might be why he doesn't quite say it and he dances up close to it. But the notion is something like this. Okay, as Kant pointed out, there are certain questions you can't ask about the universe as a whole because they're not meaningful, right? And we won't agree or disagree. We'll just mention that he said that. It's interesting to notice that the medieval theologians who are talking about the nature of God identified questions that can't be asked about God, and they were the same questions. They often overlapped. So we're not, Peterson isn't saying this and we're not affirming it, but one could say, okay, there's something about the cosmos as a whole, maybe not just creation, maybe creation plus the divine. Maybe by cosmos, what we mean is our environment and what's shaping us evolutionarily, right? And it could be nature, but it could also be the divine, which he thinks the Christians have a view that those two things are separate, or it could be that the cosmos as a whole is what we mean by the divine. It doesn't matter. We're not taking a position on that right now. What we are saying is, if we evolved, what made us what we are? Well, what made us what we are is nature, according to Darwin, selecting away everything that doesn't fit in well with it. Okay, what did that produce? It produced personalities. It produced creatures that dream. It produced and wrote into us, well, I think he'll talk about this. The idea that anthropologists have studied the dreams of 8-year-olds, and it turns out 4-year-olds and 8-year-olds have the same types of dreams. They all dream about dragons, and it doesn't even matter if their culture doesn't have any stories about dragons. The images that they dream in are of dragons. And so this Jungian idea is like, well, dragons are real in the sense that they're written into us before we even know anything about the world. They're really real, right? For him, the archetypes are the most real things. And he's going to talk more about that, so we won't talk about it now. But the idea is that it might be the archetype of the predator, right? It's a cat, bird, snake that breathes fire. It's basically everything that can come after us and have power over us if we're still monkeys in the trees. And so we're evolved to have this idea of the really bad thing that wants to get me, and it's kind of all of those things merged together make the image of that thing. In any event, um, what Peterson's dancing up against, and maybe even more than that, forget the other stuff, more than just strongly hinting at, is the idea that, okay, if what's true is what makes you navigate the world correctly as a character, if your map doesn't lead you into a pit, if it's a good reflection of the world, well, what kind of a map do you have? Well, the map is written into you, before you start reading philosophy or making arguments or doing experiments or experiencing anything. There's stuff that we've identified is written into you. Well, where did that come from? Well, it came from 4.6 billion years of Earth, or it came from 3.9 billion years of evolution, or it came from, okay, well, what does that mean? It means the universe was writing these things into us. And somebody could say, okay, well, that's accidental. You don't know if there's any truth to it. But the pragmatist approach is to say, no, wait a minute, what could be more true than something like that? I don't know if I can put it into words properly. I don't know if I've understood it correctly. It's in an image form. I can't just assume I know more than I know. But it seems like those things are more real, and it's like the dreamer or the artist or the inspired person is in touch with those archetypal forms because they're written into him. And those, where did they come from? They came from nature selecting away things that don't fit in well with it, and it produced creatures like us that dream of dragons and pantheons and deities of personality forces, right? Mars and Venus and Psyche and Cupid and the things we were looking at very briefly a moment ago. It's like, okay, the objectivist literalist scientist type says, oh, that's entertainment and it's distraction and it's fun and it's whatever, but there's no truth in it. That's the main thing. There's no truth because a truth is propositional and it can have a truth value. The Jungian types and what Jordan Peterson is doing says, well, yes, propositions can be true or false, but there could be a deeper kind of truth. There could be there could be a truth that is a personality, right? When Christ said, I am the truth, that sounds absurd to us in our post-Cartesian world and the way we think of things. What do you mean you are the truth? It's like, well, before there were ideas that were in words, there were already personal forces at work. There were ways of being in the world that could be called true or false, or they could be called Venus or Mars. They could be called, they have different interests. And so in any event, he's looking at he's looking at the artistic dream realm and saying, okay, this can be dangerous. We don't have well-defined things here. We're going to try to understand it, but we're going to be bringing ourselves to it, and we're going to need as many different lenses and checks to try to tell us that we're wrong. But let's see if we can encounter directly the art and see what it tells to us about ourselves, because you know what? I know where it came from. And where it came from was being written into us. It's as real as our skeletons. It's written into us and we're discovering it. We're having it revealed to us. The artist is getting in touch with it and then putting it in a statue form. And then we're standing in awe of the statue of Venus or the statue of David about how you can be a certain way and stare at a stone and know the future and know your destiny and be calm and strong. And as again with Venus, there's a very feminine strength in that. In any event, we won't go into the details, but we're going to be doing a lot on art soon. And we've got two artists that we're going to be interviewing, and we're going to do sort of a Socratic ion thing where we talk about all that soon. But in any event, that's what he's talking about. And he's talking about saying, he's hinting at the idea that maybe if it was written into us by the entire cosmos, that's at least the method by which God potentially could have been writing the image of himself into us. He's hinting at it. He's not saying that's for sure, and he's also not saying, even if that is true, that that's the limit of how true it is, right? So the literalists can say, yeah, it's that true, but it's more true than that if they want to. And the Dawkinites can say, well, it's not literally true, but wow, holy cow, that's a different kind of truth. I will be true, my darling. The arrow flies straight and true. It's a different use of the word. It means something different, but it's analogous. Anyway, I want to keep highlighting this because we've had so many good questions focused on what his approach is and how he's thinking, and we got to talk about them in the last two videos. But he's still doing this. Let me justify the project that we're doing here. Let me argue why it's appropriate to do it in this way thing before he's even getting into the text. And probably it looks like he's about to jump into the text, so we still have some time. Let's do it.
All right, so here's how the book opens. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. Now, this is a hard, what would you call, narrative section to get a handle on, because in order to understand it properly, you have to actually look behind it. So there are a lot of pieces of old stories in the Old Testament that flesh out the meaning of these lines. And I can give you a quick overview of it. One of the ideas that lurks underneath these lines, although you can't tell because it's in English, you have to look at the original languages, and of course I don't speak the original languages, so I've had to use secondary sources. Too bad for me. But the without form and void and the deep idea, you see, that's associated with this notion of endless deep potential. So for example, the words that are used to represent without form and void are something like, well, one is I'm going to get this partly wrong, tohu wabohu, and another one is teom. And it's important to know this because those words are associated with an earlier Mesopotamian word, which is Tiamat. And Tiamat was a dragon-like creature who represented the salt water. And Tiamat had a husband named Apsu, and Tiamat and Apsu were sort of locked together in kind of a sexual embrace. And it was that locking together of Tiamat and Apsu, and I would say that's potential and order, something like that, or chaos and order. They were locked together, and it was that union of chaos and order that gave rise in the old Mesopotamian myth, which is the Anu Melish, to being, to the old gods first, and then eventually, as creation progressed, to human beings themselves. And so there's this idea lurking underneath these initial lines that God is akin to that which confronts the unknown and carves it into pieces and makes the world out of its pieces. And the thing that it confronts is something like it's something like a predatory reptile, or it's something like a dragon, or it's something like a serpent. And I think part of the reason for that, and this is a very deep and ancient idea, is that this is where it gets so complicated to do the translation, is partly that is how human beings created our world. Like, we went out beyond the confines of our safe spaces, let's say. Our safe spaces defined by the tree or defined by the fire. And we actively voyaged outward to the places that we were afraid of and didn't understand, and conquered and encountered things out there, like literally animals, like mammoths and snakes and predators of all sorts. And it was as a consequence of that active, brave engagement with the domain of what we did not understand, the terrifying domain of what we did not understand, that the world in fact was generated. And that idea lurks deeply inside the opening lines of Genesis. And it's a profound idea in my estimation. And I think also that the way our brains are structured, and this is something that I'm going to try to develop more today, is that the ancient circuits that our ancestors used to deal with the space beyond which they had already explored, so that would be home territory. So that's that unknown territory that's characterized by promise, because there are new things out there, but also by intense danger, right? Because we're prey animals, especially millions of years ago when we were very young. We had to go out there and encounter things that were terribly dangerous. And there was a kind of, let's say, paternal courage that went along with that. And it was the spirit of paternal courage that enabled the conquering of the unknown. And there's no difference between the conquering of the unknown and the creation of habitable order. And the thing is that as our cognitive faculties have developed to the point where we're capable of very high levels of abstraction, the underlying biological architecture has remained the same. And so I don't think that it's too much to say at all that the circuits that engage you, for example, when you're having an argument about something fundamental with someone that you love, and so you're trying to structure the world around you jointly to create a habitable space that you can both exist within, you're using the same circuits, the abstracted version, you're using the same circuits that our archaic ancestors would have used when they went out into the unknown itself to encounter beasts and predators and geographical unknowns. It's the same circuit. It's just that we do it abstractly now instead of concretely. But of course it has to be the same circuit, because evolutionary is a very conservative force. And what else would it be? And this is also why I think it's so easy for us to demonize those people who are our enemies, because our enemies confront us with what we don't want to see. And because of that, our first response is to use snake detection circuitry on them, and that accounts for our capacity, almost immediate capacity to demonize.
Yeah.
And there's a reason for that. It's not a trivial thing. First of all, it's a very fast response, and second of all, it's a response that has worked for a very, very, very long time. And so one of the variants of the hero, and I would consider a variant of the hero, like a fragment of the picture of God, is the heroic warrior who slays the enemy, right? And of course, that's not precisely a politically correct representation of the hero in modern times. And, well, and no wonder, but it's still something that you go watch in movies all the time and admire, right? It's like this one of the most. How many plots are there? Romance and adventure. That's about it. And most of the adventure genre is, well, there's some enemy that's lurking in some form. It could be human, it could be alien, and someone rises up to go and confront it and maintain order. It's like there's no getting away from that story. And if you don't have that in your own life, then you play a video game where that's happening, or you watch a movie where that's happening, or you read a book where that's happening, and it captures you, even if you're atheistic and your only religion is Star Wars, and it's still, well, really, right? It still captures your imagination, and you act like someone who's possessed by religious fervor when you line up for 3 days to be the first one into the theater, and all the while claiming that you're atheistic to the core. It's like, okay, so this without form and void is this chaotic.
Right. Believe it or not, Tartaglia is coming back, and as you know, we've been having conversations about this. He's very cautious about not wanting to define truth as anything other than propositional, and we'll be having those conversations again. They're really good. But uh let's see here. So this story of approaching the unknown, right? He's saying this is a pretty foundation, right? The oldest story in the Illuminish that he talked about with Marduk. That's the oldest written story that we have, and it's of this thing of attention, willingness to face the chaos and the storms and the things that you don't understand, right? They're depicted in that chaotic way because it's outside your control, and then to cut them up and make sense out of them, and that is, he says, that's equivalent to creating habitable order, right? So let's think about that for a moment, because we have another story that we talk about sometimes, which is the Apollo Daphne story, which is very early in the creation mythology of how the cosmos came to be the way it is in Greek mythology. And so Apollo, he's got arrows and he's got vision, and he's willing to look at Python the dragon and slay it, and there's paintings we can look at of all these things, but he's representing that same quote unquote virtue, right? And what's really important for us to highlight right now is that, and Peterson talks about this a lot, ideologues, maybe they can be thought of as taking a part of the mythological truth and then expanding that to be everything, right? Another way you might call it, or you might talk about, is to say, when Zeus is off the throne and somebody else is in charge, there's no good order in the kingdom, right? So this Apollo story that starts out in the early parts of the creation, that makes things what they are. It's like, okay, we've got the world now. Now we need this Apollonian principle, this willingness to go and face the things that are hard to understand. Now, Apollo, this is a Jungian key that we're going to pull out from Peterson's lectures because we wanted to get those too, and he has quite a lot in this biblical series. It's one of them are the Jungian keys for understanding the myth. And one of the things that always bothered me, every 18 months or so over the course of my life, I would get this instinct that it would be worth reading and studying Greek mythology. And so I would try, and I'd look up some sources, and I'd try reading, and I always shake my head, and I'd be like, "Oh, who could make sense of this? Like, it doesn't make any sense." Like, Apollo, for instance, he's the god of medicine. He's the god of non-lyrical symphonic music. He's not the god of music, right? Pan exists. He's a grandfather type deity. He's of another generation. He plays the flute. He plays, so he's not the god of music, but he's the god of a certain kind of music. And he's okay, and he's also depicted as the imperial force with the ships and the army, and he's, big educational systems, small families. He's got all these different stories about himself, jealous of love, admired by women, but not really understanding the Cupid principle. There's all these different stories about him. And so I tried telling a friend of mine, a very intelligent friend of mine, about this Apollo character, and he interrupted me and he goes, "Well, is he a good guy or a bad guy? Because I'm telling these little stories about him." And that's the perfect question, because it's the wrong question, right? The wrong question is, are these archetypes the good guy or the bad guy? No, they're they're real. They're characters. You get to know them. They're good for some things. They're the answer for this problem. They're not so good over here, and they shouldn't be in charge, and they clash with each other in this setting, right? So it's not about good guy or bad guy. It's let's meet, and we're going to do this in the Ovid's Metamorphoses class, which has been put on hold now. Let's meet the family tree. Let's meet the personal forces that constitute our reality, and learn about these characters, because you make the right sacrifices and the right propitiations, maybe they're not going to possess you. Maybe you're not going to be used by them as a pawn, possessed by rage or lust, and then do things that you regret the next day. And you say, how could I have done that? It's like, well, there's another personality besides the one that's regretting right now, and it took over you, right? So one of the keys, as I was saying, is to say, okay, because this is the mistake I made for a decade and a half at least, and maybe 20 years. I'd go to these stories and I'd just be like, I don't get it. And one of the Jungian keys that Peterson's going to point out is look for the thing that's common between all the different stories. That's the essence of the character. So let's look at Apollo again. He's the god of medicine. In the poetry, he says, all the good and ill that plants do, I know. Well, what does that mean? It means he went into the chaotic jungle and he systematically broke down exactly what these plants do. This one will poison you. This one will cure this disease. This one mixed with that one, right? He cut up the chaotic potential and turned it into a disciplined, systematic science. So he's the god of science, really. That's what the scientist is doing. We're going to talk about the bad side of Apollo in a moment, because that's actually the point of the story. But that's pretty damn good, right? If you're asking yourself, how do we have a world that works, as Peterson says, habitable order? How do we create something like that? Well, the first lesson is open up your eyes and face the thing that's scariest and go out into it until you can make sense out of it. He tells the story, so I won't tell it, of what happens when you throw a rubber snake into a cage full of chimpanzees. They're The short version is they're really freaked out. They jump and they scream, and they use the part of their brain that is activated when we're swearing to scream out noises like, holy fuck, that's a terrifying snake. Eventually they get bored, and one of them eventually drops a stick on it, tries to figure it out, realizes it's not coming for him, figures it out. One of them inevitably figures out that it's a rubber snake, and then something magical happens. That's the only chimp that knows. In Apollo's temple, in his throne, there are snakes. There are dragons in the lanterns that are used by the priests. It was in Apollo's temple that the oracle at Delphi said Socrates is the wisest man. Why does he have snake imagery if he's the one that slew the snake? Because if you approach the thing that could be preying over you, you can comprehend it, you can figure it out, you can cut it into pieces, you can throw a conceptual net over it. You then get the powers of that thing. Right? All the powers of the plants of the wilds for good and ill I know, says Apollo. Why? Well, because he's called the great physician down below. He's the inventor of this method. So he represents this Marduk principle of approaching the chaos and taming it and cutting it into pieces. Now, if that's all you understand about Apollo, and you make him on the throne, he has a place to play. He's clearly has an important place to play in his role in staving off human suffering as that way of being in the world is highly significant. But he's not Zeus. He shouldn't be on the throne. He's not all there is. He can't make demands, right? So the right-wing Nazi attitude is to say, I get that. I get that. Let's grind up humanity until it fits into our designs because we've got all the answers. There's an opposing principle, and it's called Daphne, and she's the hero of the story. He's a hero too. It's both heroes. There's the one hero that approaches the chaos and makes sense out of it. Then there's the other hero that says you've built too many walls. Things can't grow. You're demanding too much. You forgot that there was a reason for all of this. It was to serve humanity, not demand that humanity prove to you that you were right about everything. And so Daphne is the first, she's a wood nymph, so she's a daughter of the river gods who are older than Zeus, right? She's a force of nature that predates the whole let's organize humanity properly thing that is the kingdom of Zeus. And she's the first one Apollo's in love with. There's statues of Apollo just lounging around and all the hours and the nymphs and the um uh what other the muses dancing in the woods with him. They're all feminine and they're all in love with him. They're washing his hair and his feet. He's got he's got the babes and he's got them for good reason, right? If you've got this principle of killing the dragon and making it that we can dance in the woods, good on you, buddy. You did a lot of good. But if you think you're the only principal, if you don't recognize there's something that flies higher than you, Cupid flies higher than him. He makes fun of Cupid for having a bow and arrow. He's like, "What are you, a little baby, a stripling, and you're playing with a bow and arrow? That's my weapon." And Cupid says, "Listen, buddy, I'm going to bring you so low. I'm going to defeat you so badly that everything you've ever done, people will think of me instead of you. Oh, you slew Python? I brought you down. I'm even greater than you." And Apollo doesn't get it. He thinks, well, whatever. And he lets the baby fly away. But Cupid's depicted with wings. He's on a higher level. And Apollo doesn't get it yet, but he learns the lesson in this story because Cupid hits him with a gold tipped arrow to make him fall in love with Daphne. And he strikes Daphne with a blunt arrow of lead whose base allay provokes disdain and drives desire away. And so Apollo's chasing her through the woods. He's in love for the first time, right? He's never understood. He says to Cupid, he says, "Why are you playing with a bow and arrow? Use fire. With that, the souls of lovers fry." He gets Venus. He understands lust, but he doesn't understand this other principle. And so Cupid brings him low. And what happens is he goes from the master of the universe to a pathetic huck, simp, begging loser who's dry humping a bush in the middle of the woods looking for a little human warmth and being declined. Like, it happens rapidly and it's really dramatic. All the stages of his degradation happen very quickly in the poetry. And it's like it brings tears to your eyes. It's fucking rough. But in that moment, uh, the reason why the Apollo's still a part of the pantheon, why he's an important principle, is that he actually learns his lesson. And in that moment, he says, "If I cannot have thee as my bride, I espouse thee as my tree." In order to escape him, Daphne is turned into a laurel tree. And when you look at the Supreme Court of the United States, when you look at documents that come from officials, when you look at the spears and the architect, the statuesque things inside the spears and on the gates of Greece and Rome, it's laurel branches. Those leaves that are around everything that Apollo made possible are laurel branches. And he says to the tree, "We're going to put you everywhere. We're going to remind ourselves all the time that everything we're doing here with these big systems that break things apart and make sense of them, all of it is to serve humanity, not demand that it be recognized as the ultimate answer. It's not the ultimate answer. We can't demand that you conform with what we expect or want." In any event, he says that, and for the first time, his interaction with Daphne is positive because she nods as a tree. She nods her consent. She accepts. She says, "I'll give up everything to make that point." And so she's the other hero, right? The Socratic hero, the Christ-like hero is the one who says to the system that thinks it is the truth and has the answers, "You believe you know more than you do, and I'll drink the hemlock, I'll take the crucifixion, I'll be turned into a tree, I'll give up everything to make the point that no, you very fucking don't." And so we get back to these two heroes, right? It is a heroic thing to slay a dragon and make the world a better place. It's the right attitude if you want to do science, if you want to rise to the top of a competition, of a hierarchy of competence. That's it. Apollo is helpful. He's the right attitude. If you think you're going to treat human beings like a game where you can figure out the point system, you're about to learn a tough lesson. Cupid's gonna bring you very low. Doesn't matter how great you look to yourself and others right now, that is not the appropriate attitude towards humanity. There's a deeper principle, there's a thing that flies higher. So, that's the short version. In the long version, we look at all the art, and it's really, really beautiful, but Apollo does learn his lesson, and his son doesn't. His son rides, Apollo says to him, "Hold back the reins. That should be your art." In every painting, I looked at it over thousands of years. Apollo bringing the sun up is in his chariot, and the musculature of his arm is pulled back as tightly as he can. He's not like Mars. He's not whipping his horses into a frenzy. He's pulling back. He's self restraining. And he says to his son, "I've made you this gift of a chariot. Take my advice as well, not just the chariot, my advice. Thine art should be the holding back of the reins. The wilds want to run wild of their own accord. And if you forget this lesson, if you whip them, and he does. Phaeton isn't a part of the deities we're supposed to be worshiping. He represents the totalitarian solution, the one that says we've got it all figured out. Join our communism or our Nazism. We are going to tell you who you are and how you're supposed to be. We'll define everything. It says if you do that, new fires will come into the world. In the last century, 24 different times we forgot that lesson. We had to invent new meanings and new words for genocide, Holocaust, and nuclear fire. New fires came into the world because we stopped understanding that political solutions are not the ultimate solutions. Our ancient ancestors dreaming and painting and sculpting were trying to tell us that. They were prophesying. They said, when you forget this lesson, that's what's going to happen. How they understood that, that's a thing to think about. But Peterson's trying. He's saying, well, maybe it's written into us and the archetypes, and perhaps it's whatever. But the idea that there could be profound meaning and truth in these ancient mythopoetic texts is when we have the ears to hear and when we learn the Jungian keys, instead of being frustrated and throwing it aside like I used to do, a tsunami of meaning is overwhelming in this art and in these stories. So we have 15 minutes left. What we're going to do is, I know we just started something new. Let's listen to a last little burst, and we have to close on time today. So
And it's a hard thing to get a grip on, what exactly this means. But I can give you another kind of example of how you would experience the formless chaos of potential in your own lives, and even how the order that you currently inhabit can dissolve into that. And in Dante's Inferno, when he outlined the levels of hell, so Dante was trying to get to the bottom of what constituted evil, really, in this representation. So it's a work of psychology, and he was thinking, well, there are various ways to behave reprehensibly, but there's a hierarchy of reprehensible behavior, and there's something absolutely the worst at the bottom. And Dante believed that it was betrayal. And I think that's right, because, one of the things that enables long-term cooperation, peaceful cooperation between people is trust. And I would also say that trust is the fundamental natural resource. There's been some very good books written on the economic utility of trust.
okay, I hate to do this for two reasons. One, we have to actually end on time, and two, he's about to start a really big point. And so what we'll do is we'll rewind to the beginning of where we paused for next time on Saturday as we pick up with our deep dive into Jordan Peterson. We're going to start with his biblical lecture series, The Psychological Significance of the Biblical Stories. And we're doing it in the context of our third year material, where we break down and decode line by line Nietzsche's Zarathustra, and we look at Kierkegaard, Jung, and Jordan Peterson as thinkers. And the line that keeps coming to mind for me is from Zarathustra: long verily should we have to wait until someone reawoke thy God for thee. So, prophesied by Nietzsche that there would be one to do. That's not my job, he said, by the way. I'm not interested in doing that, but it's going to happen. He understood the cycles and the poetry of what was necessary. Nietzsche was not an atheist. He believed in a dead God, and he believed in one that would need to be revived one day. And he saw all of that and prophesied the future of all of this. So he gets sort of the first and some of the last words. But we're going to study Peterson through the lens of through that context, and we'll pick up by rewinding a little bit. Let's go to the after conversation so we don't miss any of that. And then I do have to leave in exactly 15 minutes. So we'll do that now.